A millionaire CEO hadn't touched a woman in 20 years, but his new assistant changed everything. Before going into the video, please leave us a like and a subscribe so we have the motivation to make the next videos. The towering glass building of Blackwell Enterprises reflected the morning sun like a fortress of steel and power. Inside, employees moved swiftly, whispering among themselves, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb the very walls of the empire. The tension in the air was unmistakable. Today, a new assistant had arrived, and if history had proven anything, she wouldn't last long. "Did you hear?" One assistant whispered to another near the coffee machine. "Of course I did. Julian Blackwell just hired a new personal assistant." "Poor girl," the other sighed. "I wonder if she knows about the rule." The rule was simple but ironclad. Julian Blackwell didn't touch women. Ever. No handshakes, no accidental brushes in passing, not even a simple pat on the shoulder. His distance wasn't just professional, it was absolute. Over the years, countless rumors swirled about why he had enforced such an extreme boundary. Some said it was a traumatic past. Others claimed he was simply a cold, untouchable perfectionist. Whatever the reason, no one had dared to break the rule until today. Elena Carter, fresh-faced and armed with a stubborn streak that could rival a storm, walked into the sleek, intimidating office. Completely unaware of the whispers trailing behind her, she adjusted her blazer, holding a folder filled with documents, ready to prove herself. When she stepped into Julian Blackwell's office, the air was different, heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm. He stood behind his desk, the very image of a ruthless billionaire. His sharp blue eyes barely glanced at her before he spoke. "You're late." Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't. She had arrived exactly 5 minutes early, but she quickly realized Julian Blackwell's time wasn't measured like everyone else's. "My apologies, Mr. Blackwell," she replied smoothly, forcing a polite smile. "I'll adjust accordingly." He didn't respond, just turned slightly, adjusting his tiesha, or rather trying to. Elena frowned. Was he? No, no way. The all-powerful Julian Blackwell was struggling? "Your tie," she blurted out before she could stop herself. His sharp gaze locked onto her, like a blade pressed to her skin. "What about it?" She hesitated. The normal thing to do would be to step back, stay quiet, and let him deal with it himself. But Elena wasn't normal, and something about the way he was twisting the fabric like it was some sort of business negotiation gone wrong bothered her. "You're doing it wrong," she said before she could stop herself. The room turned silent, a dangerous silence. Julian's expression darkened, but before he could snap at her, Elena moved. Without thinking, without knowing, she stepped forward, reached out, and fixed his tie. The second her fingers brushed against the fabric of his shirt, against his neck, his body went rigid. His breath hitched. The air between them crackled, like a live wire had just been exposed. Then he flinched back. Elena barely had time to register what happened before Julian stumbled away from her touch, eyes wide, chest rising and falling like he'd just been burned. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice, sharp and uncharacteristically shaken, sliced through the air. Elena blinked, still holding on to the tie, stunned. I I was just fixing it." His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, were now filled with something else. Panic? No, fear. "Never touch me again." His words weren't just a warning, they were a command. For the first time, Elena saw it. This wasn't billionaire arrogance. This was something deeper, something painful. The office felt colder than before. Julian exhaled sharply, gripping the desk like he needed something solid to hold on to. His hands were shaking, ever so slightly. Elena swallowed, suddenly aware of the gravity of what she had done. I didn't know," she started, but he cut her off. "No one does," he muttered, his voice lower now, distant. He didn't meet her eyes. "That's why you'll forget it ever happened." Silence. Elena should have agreed. She should have nodded, apologized, and left it alone. But something about the way he stood there, frozen, as if he was stuck in a place only he could see, made her do the opposite. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "What happened to you?" Julian finally looked at her. His jaw clenched, but his eyes, the ones that had once been void of emotion, held something raw. "Get out," he said. Elena hesitated, then slowly nodded. She had just stepped into something bigger than herself, something no one had dared to question before. As she walked out, closing the door behind her, the entire office was staring. Her heart was still pounding, but one thing was clear. Elena Carter had just done the impossible. She had touched Julian Blackwell and lived to tell the tale. But the real question was, why did it affect him so much? What do you think of Elena's first day? Do you think she should try to uncover Julian's past, or should she keep her distance? Comment below and show your support for Elena. Like this story if you love emotional, powerful romance stories that keep you hooked. Subscribe to the channel to get the next part of this story and more heartwarming tales. What do you think happened to Julian in the past? Share your theories in the comments below. Julian Blackwell had spent 20 years ensuring that no one, no woman, would ever touch him. He had built his world like a fortress, a carefully structured empire of control, distance, and absolute power. He commanded respect not just through his sharp business instincts, but through the unspoken rule that no one ever dared to challenge. And then, in less than a day, Elena Carter had shattered it. He sat at his desk, gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white as he tried to slow his breathing. The feeling of her touch still burned on his skin. It wasn't like before. Before, he would recoil in disgust, his body rejecting even the slightest contact. But this time, it had been different. His pulse had quickened, but not in fear. His body had tensed, but not from disgust. He hated that he didn't understand it. Why her? Why now? He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. This couldn't happen again. He had to stop this before it went any further. With a flick of his wrist, he pressed the intercom button. Emma. His voice was sharp, controlled, betraying none of the chaos in his head. His executive secretary's voice crackled over the speaker. Yes, Mr. Blackwell. Elena Carter, he said, his tone dropping lower. Fire her immediately. A pause, a long, hesitant pause. Excuse me, sir? Julian gritted his teeth. Why was this even a question? You heard me. I want her out. Emma still didn't answer. That was unlike her. What's the problem? He snapped. Well, Emma cleared her throat. I would do that, sir, but it's not possible. His patience was razor thin. Why not? Because, Emma hesitated, clearly choosing her next words carefully. You just signed her contract this morning. If you fire her without cause, you will owe her a settlement, 6 figures minimum. Julian clenched his jaw. Of course, his own rules were now working against him. That was fine. He had another solution. Then reassign her. Put her in another department. I don't care where, just make sure she's as far away from me as possible. Another silence. Then Emma spoke again, her voice calm but firm. I'm sorry, sir, but she's already been assigned to you directly. As per your own hiring request, she can't be moved unless she voluntarily quits. Julian closed his eyes. He was trapped with her. He should have known. He had personally reviewed every aspect of her hiring process. He had made sure his assistants were bound by contracts so that only he could fire them, and only for performance-related reasons. And now, thanks to his own damn rules, he couldn't get rid of her unless she wanted to leave. His fist clenched on the desk. Elena Carter was going to be a problem. Elena, on the other hand, was completely unaware of how close she had come to losing her job. She sat at her desk, staring blankly at the computer screen in front of her, her mind replaying the moment over and over again. The way Julian flinched the second she touched him. The way he stared at her like she had done something unspeakable. The way his body reacted as if she had physically hurt him. She had only tried to fix his tie. What kind of man reacted like that to such a simple touch? She bit her lip. She should forget about it. She should focus on her work and not question it. But Elena Carter wasn't built that way. There was something there. Something deeper than just a billionaire's strange personal rule. And she wanted to know what it was. The phone on her desk rang, making her jump. She picked up. Elena Carter speaking. A pause, then come to my office. The deep, commanding voice sent a shiver down her spine. It was him. Julian stood by the window watching the city's skyline as Elena walked in. Close the door, he ordered without looking at her. She did. The click of the lock sent a sharp awareness through the room. He turned around slowly, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. We need to make something clear. Elena held his gaze. I'm listening. His eyes flickered, just for a moment. Then his voice dropped lower, colder. You will never touch me again. She swallowed but refused to look away. All right. Julian studied her, searching for signs of mockery, defiance, something. But she was calm, steady, unshaken. That was a problem. He needed her gone. Elena, he said, stepping closer, his presence overwhelming. If you don't think you can follow that rule, I suggest you quit. Right now. She inhaled sharply. So that's what this was. A test. A warning. She should be intimidated. She should walk away before she got involved in something she didn't understand. But she didn't. Instead, she tilted her head, smirking just slightly. Is this how you normally welcome your new assistants? Julian's jaw tightened. Elena, she shrugged. I mean, if you wanted me gone, you should have just said so. But I don't quit that easily, Mr. Blackwell. Something flickered in his eyes. She was standing her ground. For the first time in a long time, someone wasn't afraid of him. He should have hated it, but instead he felt something else entirely, and that was the most dangerous part. Henry Blackwood had spent 20 years building himself into the untouchable man, the billionaire CEO, the cold-hearted strategist, the man who never let anyone close. He wore his power like armor, his distance like a weapon, ensuring that no one, especially no woman, could ever break past his walls. And yet, Sophia Carter was tearing them down piece by piece. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't calculated. But it was happening. He could feel it in the way his mind betrayed him, replaying her laughter when she spoke to others. The way his body betrayed him, remembering the warmth of her hand when she had touched him, even for just a moment. And worst of all, the way his heart betrayed him, beating faster whenever she was near. This couldn't happen. Not again. Because Henry Blackwood knew what happened when a woman got too close. He had lived it before. Henry wasn't always this way. There was a time when he believed in love, when he thought he could share his life with someone who truly saw him. That someone had been Amelia Wright. She had been his everything, his first love, his greatest weakness, and his most painful mistake. He had given her everything, his heart, his trust, his future, and she had shattered it all in an instant. He still remembered the night it happened, the night he walked into the grand ballroom of the Wexley Hotel, expecting to find his fiancée, only to see her wrapped around another man, a man twice his age, dripping with wealth and influence. He hadn't wanted to believe it at first. He had told himself that there must be an explanation, that maybe he had misunderstood. But when he confronted her, when he demanded the truth, Amelia had only laughed. Oh, Henry, you really thought this was real? Her voice had been mocking, her smile cruel. You were never enough. The words had been a dagger to the heart. She had never loved him. She had loved what he could offer, the security, the status, the potential. But when someone richer, more powerful had come along, she had discarded him like nothing. And that night, Henry Blackwood had made a vow. Never again. Never again would he give his heart to someone who could crush it so easily. Never again would he let someone get close enough to hurt him. And most of all, never again would he allow a woman's touch to deceive him. But now Sophia Carter was testing every single one of those rules. It wasn't her fault. She wasn't like Amelia, he knew that much. Sophia wasn't calculating. She wasn't manipulative. She didn't play games. But she was breaking down his walls without even realizing it. Henry could feel it every time she looked at him without fear, every time she spoke to him as if he were just a man, not an untouchable billionaire, not a ruthless CEO, but just Henry, and it terrified him. Because what if he let her in? What if he lowered his guard just a little? Would she destroy him like Amelia had? Would she look him in the eyes one day and say, "You were never enough, just like before"? Or worse, what if this time he couldn't recover? That evening, Henry sat in his penthouse, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at nothing. He hadn't been able to focus all day, not on meetings, not on contracts, not on anything, because his mind was filled with her. With Sophia, with the way she had touched his wrist earlier that day, just for a second, but long enough to make his entire body react. With the way she had laughed at something Max had said at lunch, and how Henry had felt an irrational, burning jealousy in his chest. With the way she had confronted him in his office that morning, daring him to admit that something had changed between them. Henry took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the glass. This had to stop. If he let this continue, he would lose control. And losing control meant getting hurt. He refused to be that man again. The man who loved and lost. The man who was left behind. The man who was never enough. He had to put an end to this, right now. The next day, Henry made a decision. He called Sophia into his office, his face unreadable. She walked in with that unshaken confidence, her brown eyes searching his. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, crossing her arms. Henry took a slow breath. "Yes, sit down." She did, but she wasn't nervous. She never was. "I want to make something clear," he said, his tone cold, distant, controlled. Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "Whatever this is," Henry said, his voice sharper than he intended, "it stops now." Silence. Sophia blinked, her expression shifting. "What?" "This," he gestured vaguely between them. "The conversations, the unnecessary interactions, the whatever you think is happening here." Her eyes narrowed. "You mean the fact that you look at me like I'm your biggest problem, but also like you can't stop thinking about me?" His jaw tightened. "I mean," he continued, ignoring that remark, "I hired you as my assistant. That is all you will ever be." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You don't believe that." Henry's stomach twisted. He had to make her believe it, because if she didn't, he wasn't sure he could believe it himself. "I don't care what you think, Carter," he said, deliberately using her last name. "Keep your distance." Sophia held his gaze for a long, agonizing moment. Then finally she stood up. "If that's what you want," she said quietly, turning to leave. And Henry should have felt relief. But as the door clicked shut behind her, he felt nothing but regret. Henry Blackwood had spent his entire career avoiding distractions. He was a man of logic, of reason, a man who controlled every aspect of his life with ruthless precision. And yet, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he had asked Sophia Carter to be his date for the upcoming charity event. At first, he had convinced himself that it was purely strategic, just a business decision, a way to maintain his image as an involved CEO. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wanted her there. He wanted her by his side, even if he refused to admit why. The night of the event, Henry was standing near the ballroom entrance, his hands resting loosely in the pockets of his tailored black tuxedo. He had been speaking with investors, effortlessly maneuvering through small talk, when a sudden shift in the room caught his attention. He didn't even have to turn around. He felt her before he saw her, and when he finally did, he forgot how to breathe. Sophia walked in wearing a sleek, floor-length black dress that hugged her figure with an effortless elegance. The soft fabric shimmered under the warm glow of the chandeliers, and her hair cascaded in loose waves over her shoulders. She was stunning. More than that, she was dangerous, because for the first time in 20 years, Henry Blackwood wanted something he knew he couldn't control. He forced himself to look away, clenching his jaw as he turned back to his conversation. But the damage was already done. She was inside his head now. The evening unfolded smoothly. Henry and Sophia mingled, exchanged polite conversations, and managed to play the part of a powerful duo. But then, she arrived. Amelia Wright. Henry felt a shift in the atmosphere before he even saw her. The room grew heavier, the air thick with tension. And when he finally turned, his cold-hearted ex was already walking toward them, her designer gown hugging her curves, her expression dripping with arrogance. "Henry, darling." Sophia, standing beside him, subtly raised an eyebrow at the overly sweet tone. Amelia's lips curled into a knowing smile as she glanced at Sophia, her gaze sharp, calculating. "And who is this?" she asked, feigning polite curiosity. Henry felt something unfamiliar creep into his chest, an emotion he wasn't used to feeling. Protectiveness. But before he could speak, Sophia took a slow, deliberate step forward and smiled. "I'm Sophia Carter," she said, extending her hand. "Henry's date for the evening." Henry could have sworn he saw Amelia's eye twitch. She didn't shake Sophia's hand. Instead, she let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Oh, how lovely." Amelia turned her attention back to Henry. "I must say, I didn't expect you to start bringing dates to these things. You've always been so private." Henry clenched his jaw. "People change." Amelia's eyes gleamed with amusement. Do they? And then she looked at Sophia as if she was nothing. Sophia didn't flinch. She didn't look intimidated. Instead, she smiled sweetly. You must be Amelia, she said, tilting her head. I've heard a lot about you. Henry tensed. That could mean anything. Amelia smirked. All good things, I'm sure, Sophia shrugged. Not really, but I like to keep an open mind. Henry almost choked on his champagne. A flicker of irritation crossed Amelia's face, but she quickly masked it with another fake smile. Well, Henry, she purred, placing a hand on his arm, a touch that made his entire body go rigid. If you ever get tired of whatever this is, you know where to find me. Sophia's expression remained composed, but Henry felt the shift in her. He turned to Amelia, his voice flat, cold. I don't think I will. Amelia's smile faltered for the first time that night. And Sophia? She simply reached over and gently removed Amelia's hand from Henry's arm. Henry nearly stopped breathing. Sophia smiled at Amelia, the kind of smile that hit 1,000 daggers. It was lovely meeting you. Amelia's face darkened, and for the first time since their breakup, Henry felt like he had finally won. But just as Henry thought the night was over, something else happened. Something worse. Sophia had wandered off to speak with some of the guests, and Henry had been watching her, more than he should have been, when he noticed another man approach her. A tall, charming-looking executive. Henry's grip on his glass tightened. The man leaned in slightly, his posture too casual, his smile too easy. And then, it happened. He placed a hand on Sophia's lower back. Something cold and dark ignited inside Henry's chest. He didn't think. He just moved. In seconds, he was beside them. Sophia. His voice was calm, but the storm beneath it was impossible to miss. Sophia turned, surprised. Henry? Henry's gaze flickered to the man. I don't believe we've met. The man hesitated before extending a hand. Oliver Kent. Henry didn't shake it. Instead, he turned to Sophia. I need to speak with you. Now. Sophia frowned. Henry, we were just... He didn't wait for an answer. He took her hand and pulled her away from the guests, away from prying eyes, until they were alone in the dimly lit garden outside. Sophia ripped her hand away. Henry, what the hell was that? His jaw was tight, his breathing uneven. He touched you. Sophia let out a breathless laugh in disbelief. And it was just a conversation. Henry ran a hand through his hair, his mind at war with itself. Why did it bother him so much? Why did it feel like he was losing control? Sophia took a slow step forward. Are you jealous? Silence. He didn't answer. He couldn't. But his silence was answer enough. Sophia smirked. Henry Blackwood, the untouchable CEO. Jealous over me. His eyes darkened, and before he could think, before he could stop himself, he grabbed her by the waist and pulled her against him. Sophia's breath hitched. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Henry whispered, his voice raw, honest, broken. I don't want to share you. Sophia's heart pounded, and that was the moment everything changed. Henry Blackwood had spent years controlling his emotions, keeping everything and everyone at a distance. But in that one moment, as he watched another man's hand rest on Sophia's waist, something inside him snapped. It wasn't logical. It wasn't planned. It wasn't him. But it happened. Without thinking, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her away from the party, from the curious eyes, from the polished perfection of his carefully controlled world. He didn't stop until they were alone, standing in the dim glow of the rooftop garden. Sophia ripped her hand away, eyes flashing. What the hell, Henry? His breath was uneven, his pulse wild. He touched you. Sophia let out a breathless laugh, half in disbelief, half in frustration. And Henry clenched his fists. I didn't like it. Silence. The words hung between them, heavy, electric. Sophia studied him, searching for something, anything real behind that composed mask he always wore. And for the first time, she saw it. Jealousy, possessiveness, something he wasn't ready to admit. She took a slow step forward, challenging him. Are you jealous, Henry? His eyes darkened. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because the next second, before she could say another word, his lips crashed against hers. It wasn't careful. It wasn't gentle. It was everything Henry had been trying to suppress. Sophia froze for a second, caught completely off guard. But then, she kissed him back. Hard, fierce, like she had been waiting for this moment just as much as he had. Her fingers gripped the front of his jacket, pulling him closer. Henry's hand cupped the back of her neck, his touch burning against her skin, his other hand pressing against the small of her back, keeping her exactly where he wanted her. And for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't afraid of touch. He craved it. But then, reality crashed down on him. Panic seized him. His mind screamed at him to stop, to retreat, to undo what had just happened before it could mean something too real. He pulled away so suddenly it felt like a slap. Sophia blinked, breathless, her lips still tingling from his touch. Henry took a step back, then another. His chest rose and fell heavily as his mind fought against his heart. "That was a mistake," he said, forcing the words out. Sophia's heart dropped. A mistake? That's what he was calling this? She laughed, but it wasn't amused. It was bitter, disbelieving. "You kissed me like that, and now you are calling it a mistake?" Her voice was steady, but her hands curled into fists at her sides. Henry swallowed hard, his jaw tensed. "Yes." Sophia stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to say something, anything, to make this moment mean more than just fear and regret. But he didn't, and that hurt more than anything else ever had. Sophia took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. "Fine," she said, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Then let's make this simple." Henry frowned. "What? You want to pretend this didn't happen? You want to go back to your perfect little world where you don't feel anything?" She took a step back, putting physical distance between them. "Congratulations, Henry. You got what you wanted." His heart slammed against his ribs. Sophia turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, alone with nothing but the echo of what could have been. And for the first time in his life, Henry Blackwood felt like he had just lost everything. Sophia had had enough. Enough of waiting. Enough of Henry's games. Enough of the way he pulled her close, only to push her away the moment things felt real. So she made a decision. She would stop chasing him. If Henry wanted her, he would have to come to her. And that's when everything changed. At first, Henry didn't notice. He assumed she was just giving him space, recovering from his latest act of emotional cowardice. But then a week passed, then two, and Sophia was different. She still did her job flawlessly, still greeted him with a polite smile in the mornings, still attended meetings and worked late nights when needed. But something was missing. The playful smirks, the teasing remarks, the way she used to hold his gaze just a little too long. She wasn't looking at him anymore, and Henry hated it. He wouldn't admit it, of course, but every time he saw her laughing with colleagues, every time she passed by without so much as a glance, every time she walked away, without waiting for him to call her back, something inside him boiled. He told himself he was fine, but he was lying. Then came the moment he lost control completely. It was a Friday night. The office had closed early for the weekend, and Henry had planned to spend his evening alone, drowning himself in work to keep his mind off her. But then he saw the picture. It popped up on his phone unexpectedly, a photo on social media posted by one of the younger employees, a harmless group picture of some of his staff at a bar. And there she was, Sophia, dressed in a stunning black dress, holding a drink, her head tilted back in laughter. But that wasn't what made his blood turn to fire. It was the man beside her, Max, leaning just a little too close, smiling just a little too wide, his hand resting on her lower back. Henry saw red. He was out of his chair before he even realized it, grabbing his keys and storming out of the office. For the first time in his entire life, Henry Blackwood was acting on impulse. The bar was buzzing with energy, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of music. Henry didn't care about any of it. He only cared about her. And when he spotted Sophia, still sitting beside Max, still smiling at whatever nonsense the man was saying, he snapped. Sophia looked up just as Henry reached their table. Her laughter died when she saw the expression on his face, one she had never seen before. A storm, a hurricane. "Henry?" She blinked, caught off guard. He didn't even acknowledge Max, didn't care that people were watching. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, commanding. Sophia raised an eyebrow. I'm in the middle of something. I don't care. Max smirked, leaning back in his chair. Easy, Blackwood. No need to act like a jealous boyfriend. Henry's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists. Then before Sophia could react, Henry grabbed her wrist and pulled her to her feet. She gasped. Henry, 5 minutes, he said, dragging her away from the table and toward the back of the bar, where it was quieter. She let him pull her, but the moment they were alone, she yanked her arm free, stepping back with fire in her eyes. What the hell was that? Henry took a deep breath, trying to regain control. He was touching you. Sophia let out a dry laugh. And I'm allowed to let people touch me, Henry, or do you think you own me? His hands clenched at his sides. He had no answer, because deep down, he knew the truth. The very idea of another man touching her, kissing her, made him feel like he was being ripped apart from the inside. Sophia studied him for a moment, then tilted her head. Are you jealous? She asked, voice soft but sharp. Henry said nothing. She took a slow step closer. Because if you are, say it. He still didn't speak. So she pushed him further. If you're jealous, Henry, do something about it. And then he did. Before he could stop himself, before his mind could interfere, Henry grabbed the back of her neck and kissed her. This wasn't like the first time. This wasn't hesitation. This wasn't fear. This was surrender. Sophia gasped against his lips, but melted into him almost instantly, her hands gripping the front of his jacket, pulling him even closer. The world around them disappeared. The only thing that existed was them, the fire, the frustration, the undeniable, overwhelming pull that neither of them could deny anymore. Henry deepened the kiss, pouring every ounce of pent-up emotion, every moment of agony, every second of longing into it. And Sophia let him, because she had been waiting for this. When they finally pulled apart, their breathing was ragged, their hearts racing. Sophia stared at him, her lips still parted in shock. And Henry, he whispered the words that changed everything. I can't lose you. Sophia froze, because this was different. This wasn't just jealousy. This wasn't just possession. This was Henry finally breaking. Her heart pounded. She took a slow breath, searching his eyes, trying to see if this was real, if he would run again. And for the first time, he didn't look away. For the first time, he wasn't fighting it anymore. And that was when she knew Henry Blackwood was finally hers. Sophia had never been the kind of woman to beg. She had fought for Henry again and again, breaking through his walls, forcing him to confront what he felt, making him realize that love didn't have to be a weakness. But there was only so much fighting she could do, because love wasn't supposed to be one-sided. And tonight, as she stood in Henry Blackwood's office, her heart splitting in two, she realized that maybe he would never be ready to fight for her in return. What do you want from me, Henry? Sophia asked, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts to stay calm, strong. Henry stood across the room, his hands clenched at his sides, his expression unreadable. I told you, he said stiffly, this, whatever this is, it can't continue. Sophia let out a breathless laugh, but there was no humor in it, only exhaustion, only heartbreak. You mean you won't allow it to? She crossed her arms, daring him to deny it. You don't want this to continue, not because it's impossible, but because you're too much of a coward to admit what you feel. His jaw tightened. That's not true. Then prove me wrong. Silence. Sophia felt her chest tighten. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. She had expected resistance. Henry never made things easy, but she had hoped, God, she had hoped that this time he would choose her. Instead, he turned his back to her, staring out the window into the dark cityscape below. It's better this way, he murmured, for both of us. Sophia felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stay standing. You don't get to decide that for me. Henry closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, as if he were bracing himself for this moment. And then finally he turned to face her, his eyes cold, his voice detached. This is over, Sophia. She didn't know how long she stood there after those words left his mouth. A part of her wanted to scream, to demand answers, to force him to admit that he was lying, that he didn't mean a single word of it. But another part of her, the part that had been chipped away piece by piece every time Henry pulled away, knew that this was it. She had given him everything. her patience, her trust, her heart, and he had thrown it away. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. If this was how Henry wanted it, then fine. She wasn't going to stand there and beg to be loved. Sophia straightened her shoulders, her expression unreadable as she walked toward the door. She hesitated for only a second, giving Henry one last chance to stop her, to say something, to fight for her, but he didn't. So she did the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She walked away, and this time she wasn't coming back. Sophia didn't cry that night. She didn't let herself. Instead, she went home, grabbed a bottle of wine, and sat on her balcony, staring at the city lights, letting the cold night air numb the ache in her chest. She had never felt so empty, so lost. The next day, she went to work like nothing had happened. She didn't look at Henry. She didn't acknowledge his presence. She didn't care if he was watching her, because if he could pretend like she never mattered, then so could she. And she did, for weeks. She went out with friends. She threw herself into work. She even let a charming new colleague take her out for dinner. Not because she was interested, but because she refused to spend another night wondering if Henry regretted letting her go. And at first, it worked, until it didn't. Because no matter how much she tried to ignore it, no matter how much she told herself she was fine, the truth was she still loved him. And that was the worst part of it all. Henry Blackwood was a fool. He knew it the moment she walked out of his office, the moment the door clicked shut behind her, the moment he realized that she wasn't coming back. He told himself it was for the best, that he was protecting her from the inevitable disaster that came with loving a man like him. But every day without Sophia felt like a slow, suffocating death. Every time he saw her in the office, acting as if he didn't exist, it killed him. Every time she smiled at someone else, it drove him insane. And when he saw her at a bar one night, laughing with another man, it broke him completely. Because that's when he knew. He had let go of the only thing that had ever made sense in his life. And if he didn't do something fast, he was going to lose her forever. Henry Blackwood had spent his entire life avoiding emotions, believing that distance and control were the keys to survival. He had built walls so high, so impenetrable, that no one had ever come close to breaking through. Until Sophia Morse. And now she was gone. And for the first time in his life, the silence was unbearable. At first, Henry tried to convince himself that this was for the best. He told himself that he had made the right choice, that he had spared her the inevitable pain of dealing with a man like him, a man who didn't know how to love properly, who only knew how to push people away. But no matter how many times he repeated those words, it didn't stop the ache in his chest. It didn't stop the way his eyes searched for her in the office, even when he told himself not to look. It didn't stop the sharp pang of jealousy every time he saw her laughing with someone else, looking like she had moved on effortlessly, while he was left behind, drowning in a sea of regrets. And then one night he saw her with someone else. Henry had been trying to bury himself in work, pretending that if he focused hard enough on numbers, deals, and contracts, he could ignore the way his life felt emptier without her. But then, purely by accident, or maybe by cruel fate, he ended up at the same bar where she was. And there she was. Sophia Morris, his Sophia, sitting at a corner table, smiling at another man. Henry froze, his breath catching in his throat. The man sitting across from her was laughing, leaning in just a little too close, touching her hand casually on the table. And she didn't pull away. A sharp, foreign feeling stabbed through Henry's chest. Jealousy. Pure, unfiltered, gut-wrenching jealousy. Before he could stop himself, before he could think, he was already moving toward her table. Sophia noticed him at the last second, her eyes widening in shock as he stopped beside her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice calm but guarded. Henry ignored the man completely. "We need to talk," he said, his voice lower than he intended, his control slipping. Sophia's date raised an eyebrow. "Do you mind? We're kind of in the middle of something, and about nothing." Henry turned to him, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Yes, I do mind." Sophia let out a frustrated sigh, placing her hands on the table. "Henry, this isn't the place for this." "I don't care," he admitted. "Just 5 minutes, Sophia, that's all I ask." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Maybe proof that he was serious, maybe just confirmation that he was really here, doing this. And then she stood up. 5 minutes, she repeated. And then I go back to my date. Henry clenched his jaw, hating those words, hating that she even had the option of going back to someone else. But he didn't argue. Because he knew that if he didn't say what he needed to say now, he might never get another chance. They stepped outside where the night air was cool against Henry's skin, but he felt nothing but fire inside. Sophia crossed her arms. Well, say what you need to say. Henry took a deep breath, and then, for the first time in his entire life, he let go of his pride. I love you, Sophia. She blinked, her lips parting slightly, caught off guard, completely unprepared. What? I love you, he repeated, his voice raw and steady. I should have said it before. I should have fought for you. But I was too scared, and I lost you because of it. Sophia looked away for a moment, shaking her head. Henry, no, let me finish. He stepped closer, desperate to make her understand, desperate to make her see how much this was killing him. I pushed you away because I didn't know how to handle this, he admitted. I told myself I didn't need love, that it was a distraction, a weakness. But the truth is, without you, nothing makes sense anymore. I don't want to live in a world where you're just another person I used to know. Sophia let out a breath, her arms tightening around herself. He could see it, the pain in her eyes, the part of her that still wanted to believe him. But she had already been hurt once, and she wasn't going to fall so easily again. Sophia took a slow step back, her expression unreadable. If you love me, she said softly, prove it. Henry's chest tightened. I'm standing right here, telling you. No, she cut him off. Words mean nothing, Henry. She swallowed hard, her voice wavering just slightly. You had me once, and you broke me. So if you really love me, if this isn't just some last-minute realization because you saw me with another man, then you'll have to do more than just show up and say the words. Henry stared at her, knowing she was right, knowing that he had one last chance to get this right. But before he could say anything, she turned and walked away, disappearing back inside the bar, back to her date, back to a life without him. And Henry stood there, feeling the weight of his own mistakes crushing him. For the first time in his life, love was on the line. And for the first time, he was going to have to fight for it. What do you think? Can Henry really change? Or is it too late for him and Sophia? Like this, if you think Henry needs to prove himself, comment below, should Sophia give him another chance or should she move on? Subscribe for the next part, because Henry is about to make the biggest decision of his life. Henry Blackwood was not the kind of man who begged. He had spent his entire life controlling everything, his emotions, his business empire, his image. He never pleaded, never admitted weakness, and certainly never humiliated himself in front of anyone. But for Sophia Morris, he would do anything. And that's how, for the first time in his life, the mighty CEO found himself standing in the middle of his own office, surrounded by his employees, holding his entire heart in his hands. And the whole world was about to witness his surrender. After weeks of silence, of cold avoidance, of watching Sophia slip further and further away, Henry couldn't take it anymore. He had tried to bury himself in work, tried to convince himself that he had made the right decision. But every morning when he walked into the office and saw her desk empty, a pain unlike anything he had ever known ripped through his chest. Sophia had quit the company. And that's when he knew this wasn't just about pride anymore. This was life or death. Because without her, nothing mattered. And if he didn't fight for her now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. So he did the one thing he had always sworn he would never do. He let the world see his heart. That morning, Henry stormed into the office, ignoring every single meeting, every single investor waiting to speak with him. Nothing mattered. All that mattered was Sophia. So in front of every single employee, in the middle of the office, Henry took a deep breath, steeled his nerves, and did the unthinkable. He knelt down. A collective gasp spread through the office. Phones were lifted. Cameras started recording. The mighty, untouchable Henry Blackwood was on one knee in the middle of the company he built, holding a small black box in his hands. And at that exact moment, Sophia stepped out of the elevator. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. She had come back only to pick up the last of her things, expecting nothing more than a cold, silent goodbye. But instead she found him, looking up at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. And then he spoke. Sophia Morris, Henry's voice rang through the office, deep and steady, but filled with raw emotion. I was a fool. A murmur spread through the crowd. Employees exchanged glances, completely stunned. Henry continued. I spent my whole life running from feelings, pretending that I didn't need love, that I didn't need anyone. He let out a shaky breath, his jaw tightening. And then I met you. Sophia sucked in a sharp breath. Her heart was pounding, her hands trembling. You walked into my life and destroyed every wall I built, Henry said, his voice cracking slightly. You made me feel something I never wanted to feel. You made me need you. Sophia blinked rapidly, tears burning behind her eyes. Henry's fingers clenched around the ring box, but I was too much of a coward to admit it. He swallowed hard. I pushed you away. I hurt you. And I spent every second after that wishing I could take it all back. His eyes met hers, pleading, raw, desperate. But I can't change the past. His hands shook slightly as he slowly opened the ring box, revealing a stunning diamond ring. Simple, classic, but undeniably perfect. All I can do, Henry said, his voice lower now, almost breaking, is ask you to give me a second chance. The office was silent. No one even breathed. Sophia's heart clenched painfully because she wanted to believe him. She wanted to run into his arms, to forget every ounce of pain he had caused her, to believe that this time it would be different. But how could she be sure? How could she know this wasn't just another moment of impulse? And then he said the words that shattered every single one of her doubts. I don't care about the company, Henry said suddenly, his voice trembling. A few gasps echoed through the office. What? I don't care about money, power, or reputation. He took a deep breath, his next words spoken so quietly only Sophia could hear. None of it matters. Without you. Sophia gasped softly, because she saw it now. This wasn't just words. This was Henry Blackwood completely breaking himself open, standing before her with no armor, no pride, no defenses. He was giving her everything. And this time, she believed him. For a long, painful second, Henry thought she was going to say no. The office was silent. The whole world was waiting. And then a single tear slid down Sophia's cheek. She smiled. And then she nodded. Yes. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, pure shock. But Henry heard none of it, because the second she said that word, he stood up, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her. The moment their lips met, the entire world disappeared. And for the first time in his entire life, Henry Blackwood finally knew what happiness felt like. A love worth fighting for. The wedding of the century. From the moment Henry Blackwood dropped to his knee in the middle of his office and asked Sophia Morris to marry him, the world knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary love story. This was a story about breaking walls, healing wounds, and proving that love is always worth fighting for. And now, standing at the altar, with the woman who changed his entire life walking toward him, Henry knew he had never been more certain of anything. Their wedding was far from traditional, because how could it be? Sophia, the woman who had challenged a billionaire CEO, the woman who had made the most powerful man in the city kneel for love, was never meant to have an ordinary love story. Neither was Henry. So of course their wedding was filled with disasters. The flower girl tripped. The cake nearly collapsed. The best man forgot the rings and had to run back to the car while the guests waited in suspense. And Sophia? She was 20 minutes late, not because of cold feet, but because she got caught up trying to fix her veil and somehow managed to rip the hem of her dress in the process. But when she finally appeared at the end of the aisle, looking more beautiful than Henry had ever seen her, he forgot everything else. The world disappeared. Nothing mattered. Not the late start, not the nervous whispers from the guests, not the fact that Henry was sweating bullets in his expensive suit. All that mattered was her, and when their eyes met, he saw it. The same love, the same defiance, the same fire that had drawn him to her from the very beginning. She was his, and today he was going to make sure the whole world knew it. Henry never liked public speaking, but when he held Sophia's hands in his, looking at the woman who had completely changed him, the words came naturally. Sophia Morris, he said, his voice steady, filled with emotions only she could bring out of him. I spent my whole life running from love, from people, from everything that made me feel vulnerable. Sophia squeezed his hands, her smile soft, understanding. But then, you happened. A few chuckles echoed through the crowd, because everyone knew Sophia was a force of nature. You walked into my office, completely unafraid. You ignored every single one of my rules. You drove me insane. She grinned. Still do. The guests laughed, but Henry didn't, because in this moment, nothing had ever been more serious. And somehow, despite all of that, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. You made me love you. Sophia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. You showed me that love isn't a weakness, that letting someone in doesn't mean losing control. It means finally finding a reason to stop fighting. He took a deep breath. I don't deserve you, but I will spend the rest of my life proving that I do. Tears finally spilled from Sophia's eyes, but she was smiling, radiant, happy. Then it was her turn. Henry Blackwood, she started, her voice a little shaky, but filled with love. I never wanted a perfect love story. I never believed in fairy tales. And I definitely never thought I'd fall for a billionaire CEO with a fear of human contact. Laughter. But here we are. She took a breath, looking at him like he was the only man she had ever wanted. And if there's one thing I know about love, it's that the best kind isn't perfect. It's the kind that makes you better. She smiled. And that's what you do, Henry. You make me better. You make me want to fight for love, for us, for this crazy, beautiful life we're building together. She bit her lip, her voice thick with emotion. So yeah, I'm marrying you today, even though you drive me crazy, even though you're the most stubborn man I've ever met. Henry laughed, shaking his head. But I wouldn't want it any other way. And with that, she slipped the ring onto his finger. The moment the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Henry didn't wait. He grabbed Sophia, dipped her backward, and kissed her like his entire world depended on it. The guests cheered, confetti rained down, and for the first time in his life, Henry Blackwood knew he had found his home. Not in his office, not in his success, but in Sophia. Their love story didn't end there, because marriage wasn't a finish line, it was just the beginning. There were arguments. Sophia was still stubborn, and Henry was still learning how to open up. There were mishaps. Sophia once nearly burned down their kitchen trying to cook Henry breakfast in bed. There were unexpected moments of tenderness, like the nights Henry pulled her into his arms, whispering, I still can't believe I get to love you. And most importantly, there was laughter. A love filled with imperfect, chaotic, beautiful moments. Because love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other over and over again, no matter what. If there's one thing Henry and Sophia's story teaches us, it's this. Love is worth the risk, even if it terrifies you, even if it forces you to break down every wall you've built around your heart. Love requires work. It's not always easy, and it's not always perfect, but it's about showing up every single day for the person who means everything to you. Running won't protect you from pain. It will only keep you from happiness. Second chances exist, and when you find love, the kind that changes everything, you fight for it every single day. Did Henry and Sophia's story move you? Drop A in the comments if you believe in a love worth fighting for. What's the biggest lesson you learned from their journey? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like this story if it made you laugh, cry, or believe in second chances. Subscribe to our channel for more heart-stopping, emotional love stories that will leave you breathless. Because love isn't just a fairy tale. Sometimes it's a little messy, a little complicated, and absolutely completely worth it.